Committee on National Security will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. The Muslim Brotherhood is a militant Islamist organization with affiliates in over 70 countries, including groups designated as terrorist organizations by the U.S. Whether the Muslim Brotherhood writ large should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization has been the topic of debate here in Congress in recent years and has been under consideration by the Trump administration. Thankfully, the Trump administration has discarded the Obama-era policy of treating the Brotherhood as a potential ally. Now the questions are focused on how expansive to make the terror designation and whether it should be done through the State Department or Treasury Department. The Muslim Brotherhood has been militant from its very beginning. Its founder, Hassan al-Banna, who started the group in 1928, said that, quote, "Jihad is an obligation from Allah on every Muslim and cannot be ignored nor evaded." And in a book titled The Way of Jihad, he wrote, "Jihad means the fighting of the unbelievers and involves all possible efforts that are necessary to dismantle the power of the enemies of Islam, including beating them, plundering their wealth, destroying their places of worship, and smashing their idols," end quote. This belief was put into action in the decades that followed, as the Muslim Brotherhood's members committed numerous acts of terrorism, including the assassination of Egypt's Prime Minister in 1948. This jihadist ideology continues to fuel the Muslim Brotherhood today. The Brotherhood mourned the death of Osama bin Laden, and its leaders developed teachings justifying revolutionary violence under Sharia law. The Brotherhood has preached hatred towards Jews, denied the Holocaust, and called for Israel's destruction. The Brotherhood has incited violence against Coptic Christians in Egypt amidst a wave of church bombings and other attacks by terrorist groups, including ISIS. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, perhaps the Brotherhood's preeminent cleric, issued a fatwa legitimizing terrorist attacks against American troops in Iraq, and he's also deemed the Holocaust to be a, quote, punishment for Jews, and expressed hope that another Holocaust would someday be carried out by his fellow Islamists. The Muslim Brotherhood's supreme guide, Mohammed Badi, has said that the organization's goal is to establish a new Islamic caliphate, including the imposition of Sharia law, which is a totalitarian Islamic legal code. We saw what happens when the Brotherhood takes control of a country in Egypt from 2012 to 2013, and the results were chilling. That then-President Mohamed Morsi defied the rule of law and granted himself near-absolute power. As Egyptian leader Mohamed al-Baradei put it, Morsi usurped all state powers and appointed himself Egypt's new pharaoh. The Brotherhood's legislators enshrined the principles of Sharia as the main source of law in Egypt's constitution, while the Morsi government used state institutions to promote Islamic radicalism, rolled back freedom of the press, and launched a wave of blasphemy prosecutions. The Morsi Muslim Brotherhood government is no more, but the Brotherhood and its affiliates continue to advance their agenda across the Middle East and throughout the world. There's no question that the Muslim Brotherhood affiliates are involved in terrorism. Former FBI Director Robert Mueller confirmed as much in testimony before Congress when he said that elements of the Brotherhood, both here and overseas, have supported terrorism. A number of these Brotherhood affiliates have been designated as terrorist organizations by the United States government. The Muslim Brotherhood's Palestinian branch, Hamas, has been a designated foreign terrorist organization since 1997. Hamas has taken control of the Gaza Strip, launched thousands of rockets against Israeli civilians, and committed suicide bombings and other terrorist attacks that have murdered numerous Israeli and American civilians. Muslim Brotherhood networks raise money here in the U.S. to support Hamas's terrorist activities in the Middle East. According to the Department of Justice, in the early 1990s, Hamas's parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, planned to establish a network of organizations in the U.S. to spread a militant Islamist message and raise money for Hamas. And the Texas-based Holy Land Foundation became the chief fundraising arm for the Palestine Committee in the U.S. created by the Brotherhood to support Hamas. In 2008, the Holy Land Foundation leaders were convicted of crimes, including providing material support for Hamas. Most recently, the State Department designated two offshoots of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, HASM and Liwa al-Thawra, as terrorist organizations under Executive Order 13224. The State Department noted that these groups are responsible for bombings and assassinations of senior Egyptian officials. This hearing is an opportunity to discuss what the United States' next step should be in combating the Muslim Brotherhood's threat. Countries including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have all designated the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I know there's disagreement among experts on how best to use terrorist designations to address the threat posed by the Brotherhood and its affiliates, and we have different perspectives on this issue represented within our panel today, and I look forward to hearing the witnesses' recommendations. Between the radicalism of its hateful ideology, the danger of its theocratic rule as seen in Egypt, its networks, including Hamas and HASM, and its powerful state sponsors, it is clear that the Brotherhood constitutes a real threat to the national security interests of the United States. We can debate the best way to counter this threat, but simply ignoring the threat is not an acceptable answer. We do have a distinguished panel of witnesses here to discuss these issues. I want to thank all of them for taking their time to come and provide testimony, and it's my pleasure to now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank you for holding this hearing to examine the multinational religious, political, and social movement known as the Muslim Brotherhood. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for their willingness to help this subcommittee with its work. The Independent Program on Extremism at George Washington University describes the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1928 in Egypt, as, quote, the world's oldest and arguably most influential contemporary Islamist movement, close quote. While the Muslim Brotherhood spans the Middle East and Africa and has spread into Southeast Asia and the West, it has manifested itself globally in very varied forms, ranging from nonviolent political actors to groups that have resorted to terrorism. According to the Program on Extremism, some affiliated groups, chapters, and radical offshoots inspired by the Brotherhood's Islamic ideology are marked by their adaptability to the local politics in a given country, their pursuit of individual organizational goals, and their complete operational independence. While at one point the Central Brotherhood body in Egypt officially renounced terrorism and violence under the Sadat regime in the 1970s, there is no doubt that certain affiliated organizations and spawn groups continue to espouse and engage in violent terrorist activity. Chief among them is Hamas, which has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States State Department since 1997. The original charter issued to establish Hamas in 1988 identified the terrorist group as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood splinter groups such as Liwa al-Thawra and Hassim also continue to engage in violence in Egypt. These organizations have perpetrated assassination attempts against Egyptian defense and security officials and bombings against government sites, including attacks against the police training center in the city of Tanta and the Myanmar embassy in Cairo in 2017. Meanwhile, democratically elected political parties that also fall within the Muslim Brotherhood umbrella represent a significant voting bloc in the parliaments and governing coalitions of some of our key counterterrorism allies in the Middle East and North Africa. In Jordan, which has served as the most critical regional ally in our coalition efforts to degrade and destroy the Islamic State, Brotherhood-affiliated opposition parties, such as the Islamic Action Front, hold several seats in the National Assembly. In Morocco, which remains a reliable regional partner in U.S. efforts to counter extremism and combat the Islamic State, the Islamist Justice and Development Party leads the coalition government. Ennahda, the main Islamic party in Tunisia, similarly leads the coalition government and has overseen the country's democratic transition since 2011. The State Department lists Tunisia, along with Jordan and Morocco, as our committed partners in the coalition to defeat the Islamic State. In light of the multifaceted composition of the Muslim Brotherhood, our national security strategy under Republican and Democratic administrations alike has focused on identifying the terrorist threats posed by individual affiliates and leaders. Most recently, the State Department listed the President of Hamas Political Bureau as a, quote, specially designated global terrorist, close quote, in January of 2018, stemming from his ties with Hamas's military wing. The two Brotherhood branches involved in the 2017 terrorist attack in Egypt also received this designation. It's my understanding that some of my colleagues in Congress have called for the Trump administration to go further and to designate the entire Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization, just as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates have done. The effectiveness of our counterterrorism and force protection operations in the Middle East and North Africa demand that we approach this issue with caution. A wholesale designation would severely complicate our relationship with the regional security partners, including Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, Turkey, and Kuwait, where the Muslim Brotherhood functions within mainstream government and society. Former Secretary of State Tillerson underscored this challenge during his congressional testimony last year. His statement was, and I quote, "I think you can appreciate the complexities this enters into our relations with governments where the Muslim Brotherhood has matriculated to become participants, and in those elements they have done so by renouncing violence and terrorism," close quote. It could also further escalate the tension in the Middle East, which is already operating at a heightened state of conflict, where we still have 2,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Syria, an estimated 6,000 troops deployed in Iraq. Just last month, Mr. Issa of California and I led a bipartisan congressional delegation to the Middle East to assess regional security and stability amidst the 8-year civil war in Syria and the 4th year of civil war in Yemen. As we discussed during bilateral meetings with King Abdullah of Jordan, President el-Sisi of Egypt, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, and other allied leaders and military officials, national security currently demands that we deconflict the chaos coming from these multi-layered conflicts. The Muslim Brotherhood is experiencing significant decline in many countries in the Middle East. It is social conservatism that is being rejected by a younger generation that is leading to that and accelerating that decline. It would be counterintuitive if we lumped political actors, nonviolent, non-terrorists, in with the groups that we wish to designate for their violent and terrorist activities. I would hope that our witnesses would give us direction on how best to isolate those who engage in unacceptable terrorist activity and not inadvertently give support to those very same individuals. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. We have Dr. Hillel Fradkin, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, President and Founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and Ambassador Daniel Benjamin, Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you could please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order for allowed time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows the remaining time during your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn on your microphone before speaking. And with that, Dr. Fradkin, you're up for 5 minutes.
First, I'd like to begin by thanking Chairman DeSantis and Ranking Member Lynch and their colleagues for the invitation to address this hearing. It's a privilege to participate in this hearing and its discussion of a most important subject, the Muslim Brotherhood's global threat. After listening to the opening statements, it's a particular privilege because I can see from the statements that both the Chairman and the Ranking Member are extremely well informed about the subject. But that leads to a problem. I'm not sure what I may reasonably add to what has already been said. I will give it a go and probably go over some of the same points that you enunciated and maybe flesh out a few things along the way. Generally speaking, This subject entails three general questions. First, is the Muslim Brotherhood a global threat? Second, if it is a global threat, how successful has it been or might be? Third, what can be done to address this threat? And I do understand that's one of the principal objectives here. I'm going to principally address the first two questions in the prepared remarks, and then I expect we'll discuss the third question more generally during the discussion period. Is the Muslim Brotherhood a global threat? Part of the answer is clear. The Brotherhood certainly means to be global, and it means to be a threat. More specifically, the Muslim Brotherhood is devoted to a political and religious project that, in principle, in its essential character and goals, is hostile to other forms of politics, including our own. And it means for this project to be global in extent. And both of these things have been true for a long time, since the founding of the Brotherhood some 90 years ago by Hassan al-Banna. This had to do with the nature of the project itself. What was that project? In response to this question, Banna offered a simple five-fold formulation that has remained the motto slogan of the Brotherhood ever since. Quote, Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our constitution, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. Banna proposed this political religious goal as the alternative to the new nation-state politics of his native Egypt. More emphatically, he proposed this as the only legitimate form of Muslim politics simply. Its virtue was to renew and embody the authentic Muslim way of life, the way of life constituted, as he put it, by the Quran and the example of the Prophet. As such, it applied to all Muslims everywhere. Hence, his project was necessarily global in principle. To use a term that has recently become familiar, it was to wind up establishing the Islamic State. In accord with this, Banna sought to establish branches of the Brotherhood in other countries and over time partially succeeded. Banna was murdered in 1948, but the essential tenets he prescribed for the Brotherhood have never been repudiated. This, I believe, is not controversial, nor should it be, that there has been no real change in the essential principles. And I may add, this was enunciated very, very clearly by a man named Khayrat al-Shater, who was the deputy guide of the Egyptian Brotherhood in the spring of 2011, after the revolt had started, in a very, very interesting speech, which I might reference again later, in which he insisted that nothing that they were doing was inconsistent with or in violation of what the original vision was. What has been controversial is what the Brotherhood project practically means and where it falls within the universe of other radical Islamic organizations. The controversy is, I can put it this way, there was the suggestion, especially beginning after 9/11, that by comparison with al-Qaeda and other similar organizations, the Brotherhood was moderate and could be a force for moderation. It was argued that it no longer seriously embraced the radical vision Banna had enunciated. Rather, it was ready to participate in ordinary politics, and through that participation would further moderate. As Chairman DeSantis mentioned, we have now had one important test of those hopes, and they've proven to be false. The form of this test was the Brotherhood's sudden, if brief, rise to power in Egypt after the revolt of 2011. While in power, it attempted to establish a new regime in Egypt that would more or less conform to its founding radical vision. And I want to stress that this was by intention. Well, Shatter thought that the time of the final stage of the Brotherhood project had arrived. He was wrong, and the project failed. Where does that leave the Brotherhood today? I know my time is up, but I'll conclude with
Just wrap it up if you can.
with a couple of sentences. Certainly within Egypt, the Brotherhood is for the present a broken organization, but it has sustained defeats before, partially by finding bases elsewhere. In the 60s, this meant Saudi Arabia. Today, it means Turkey and Qatar. What it will attempt to do from these bases remains to be seen. And I also want to add one final thing. It's often thought that Al-Qaeda is hostile to the Brotherhood, and that's been certainly true. Very recently, I think within the last month or so, the present head of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, made a speech in which he referenced the old ties, the old roots between the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda with great nostalgia, and welcomed the Brotherhood members to his own project, or to a reconciliation of sorts. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the permission to go over.
Appreciate it. Dr. Shanzer, 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of FDD, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. In 2011, President Barack Obama's Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, famously sparked an outcry when he said that the Muslim Brotherhood was a, quote, heterogeneous group, largely secular, which has eschewed violence and has decried al-Qaeda as a perversion of Islam, end quote. Clapper was way off the mark. For one, the Muslim Brotherhood is a gateway to jihadism, as we have already noted this morning. It's also a hate group. Its ideology is xenophobic, bigoted, and totalitarian. And the Brotherhood is not exactly heterogeneous either. Many branches subject their members to rigid indoctrination and demand unwavering commitment to the Brotherhood's deeply intolerant interpretation of Islam. Still, the Brotherhood's branches do differ tactically. In Tunisia and Morocco, it is part of the ruling elite. In Jordan and Malaysia, it's the loyal opposition. In Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, it is banned outright, forcing the group to work underground. And the fact that the various factions do not all engage in violence makes it difficult to designate the movement in its entirety. But that does not mean that Washington is without recourse. The Treasury and State Department designated 2 suspected Egyptian Brotherhood offshoots, Hassam and Liwa Thawra, earlier this year. Both groups carried out deadly attacks against the Army, the judiciary, and the police since 2016. In making the case for the designations, the Brotherhood links to these groups were actually inconsequential. What mattered was the legal criteria, their track records of violence and support for terrorism. The goal now is to find others that meet this criteria. And to that end, I have 2 suggestions. One is the Libyan Hizbul Watan, led by Abdul Karim al-Hajj, who previously led the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, a designated terrorist group here in the U.S. Belhaj was also believed to be training members of Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, another U.S. designated terrorist group. Another is Al-Islah, which is Yemen's affiliate. One co-founder of Islah is Abdul Majid al-Zindani, who allegedly helped to coordinate the 2000 attack on the USS Cole. In 2013, the Treasury noted that Zindani issued religious guidance in support of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Islah figures also reportedly harbored arch-terrorist Anwar al-Awlaki prior to his 2011 death by a U.S. drone strike. Do these groups meet criteria? I don't know. Ask the intelligence community. In the meantime, we must also look at the Brotherhood's state sponsors, namely Turkey and Qatar. Turkey's ruling AK party is effectively the Turkish arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan famously dispatched a Turkish campaign strategist to Egypt to help Mohamed Morsi win the election, then sent billions of dollars to keep his regime afloat. After Morsi's ouster in July 2013, Turkey became a home for exiled Brotherhood. Hamas operatives have also made their home there, including Salah Haruri, the head of the West Bank military wing, who ordered a triple murder in 2014 that sparked a massive rocket war with Israel. Turkish support for the Brotherhood-linked military activity also appears to extend to Libya. Press reports suggest that Turkey has been shipping arms to Libyan Brotherhood factions, and Turkey now hosts several Brotherhood affiliate TV channels as well. And speaking of TV channels, we can't forget Qatar. Qatar is the owner of the pro-Brotherhood TV channel Al Jazeera, but its support extends far beyond that. After Morsi was elected, Doha gave the Egyptian regime billions in aid. Qatar today provides safe haven for many exiled Brotherhood figures. Other factions that enjoy Qatari support include Tunisia's Nahda movement, Yemen's Islah, Libya's Hizbul Watan, and of course, Hamas. Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, I offer 4 recommendations today. 1, do not waste valuable federal resources trying to designate the entire Brotherhood. Focus on the factions that have a record of violence and terrorism finance. Number 2, use Treasury's tools to reinforce existing designations. For example, Hamas, Hasam, Liwa, Thawra are already designated. Treasury should sanction their support networks. These derivative designations are bureaucratically easier to achieve, while designations of new entities can often get caught up in the red tape of the interagency process. Number 3, confront Turkey and Qatar. Their support to the Brotherhood is undermining our efforts in that crucial battle of ideas. And 4, support the House NDAA provision calling for a report on the Muslim Brotherhood. It is important that we here in the U.S. conduct our own assessment of this organization and formulate a strategy to address this important challenge. On behalf of FDD, thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Jasser, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeSantis and Ranking Member Lynch and other members of the House Subcommittee on National Security for holding this very important hearing on the Muslim Brotherhood's global threat. Our American Islamic Forum for Democracy is a counter-Islamist American Muslim think tank and activist based in Phoenix, Arizona. I ask that my full written testimony be placed into the record. I am here today because as an American Muslim, I have dedicated my life to American security and freedom, not only with 11 years in the U.S. Navy, but since 9/11, formally countering the oppressive and radicalizing influence of Islamist groups in the West upon our communities. No group embodies the threat of the radical Islamists more than the Muslim Brotherhood, or in Arabic, Ikhwan al-Muslimin. The Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. Help us modern-minded, secular, liberal Muslims marginalize their influence by declaring them what they are, a terrorist organization. Unfortunately, much of the conversation about the Brotherhood has been obstructed, muted, marginalized, deferred, minimized by the Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers or their allies here in the West. I have to tell you in my heart of hearts, I think those who give the Ikhwan excuses, either say they're not monolithic, they're democratic, they're nonviolent, they have branches, must really believe that our entire faith of Islam, my faith, is just shades of oppressiveness of theocracy, so we have to tolerate the nonviolent theocrats. Somehow we Muslims are sentenced terminally having to accept the leadership and control of the global network of the terrorists of the Muslim Brotherhood. In point of fact, nothing would be more pro-Muslim than the marginalization of the Muslim Brotherhood and its direct affiliates. Making the Muslim Brotherhood radioactive would allow the light to shine upon the most potent antagonists in Muslim communities, those who reject political Islamist groups and believe in liberty and the separation of mosque and state. In my short time, I wanted to quick paint 2 pictures for you. First, this diagram, it may be hard to read, but bottom line, just so we understand what we're talking about, the Muslim Brotherhood, if you look at the top there, 1.6 billion Muslims, I think you can divide them politically into Islamists who believe in Islamic states and secularists. Under the Islamists, you've got Sunni and Shia strains. All Muslims have 2 major sects, if not more. There are other heterogeneous sects. But 90% of are Sunni, 10% are Shia. Within the Sunni strain of Islam are political Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafis, and Jamaat Islami in Pakistan. The Brotherhood has offshoots of terror groups, and the nonviolent group, I believe, gives cover to the Muslim Brotherhood terror groups, if you will. So that just sort of lays it out as being a strain of Sunni Islam. I think that's important because if we start this project by labeling the Muslim Brotherhood factions in various countries terror groups, I think it also then should not give a pass to the Khomeinists in Iran, to other strains, Salafi jihadis, ISIS, etc. So just so you understand where they fit. The next slide looks at the logo, and I think it's important to understand what they are. They have not changed their logo, and at the bottom, under those swords, which are not peaceful, that are not violent symbol, it says Wa'aidu. And Wa'aidu is from chapter 8, verse 16 of the Quran, and it says, make ready. And it's not the Boy Scouts, be prepared, make ready. This is a passage in the Quran that refers specifically to battle and preparing for militancy. This, despite them coming to power in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere, they never changed this symbol and what they are. Thank you for those slides. Al-Banna and Qutb, as you've heard before me, put forth the notion that Islam is an all-encompassing for society, and if you look at the motto, it says, as has been pointed out, that death for the sake of God is their highest aspiration. So let's define a terror group. Terror group means that the actors use any possible targeting of non-combatants or even combatants outside the rules of war in order to advance the supremacist hegemonic aspirations. The Muslim Brotherhood has never condemned theologically or ideologically the use of terrorism, and if they have, it's been a cover since they've reverted to that repeatedly. No, Muslims are not monolithic, but the Brotherhood, whether it's 1.0 or 9.0 in the last 90 years, is monolithic, and only trying to say it's not monolithic is dancing on the head of a pin. Like the Cold War, communism was a cancer, but the war was against Soviet communism. Here, Islamism is the cancer within our faith communities, but the war is against the Ikhwan. We need to be in the offense, and for too long we've been on the defense, worried about what the reactions will be. And ultimately, I see that concern, that defensiveness on the American posture about naming the Brotherhood a terrorist organization, at its best, a form of bigotry of low expectations when it comes to Muslims. The common enemy theory, saying that, well, the Brotherhood has a common enemy with us against ISIS and al-Qaeda, is offensive to me not only as an American but as a Muslim. I hear the same thing in saying that we should support genocidal tyrants like Assad because they have common enemies with us against ISIS. Many people try to separate the central elements of these parties from the militant terrorist progeny. Recep Erdogan, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood group in Turkey, also known as the AKP, said democracy is like a train. We ride it until we get where we want to go, and then we get off. It is time that we made them radioactive. I detail in my testimony all of the connections, the revolving door between various al-Qaeda groups, humanitarian organizations in the West and in the Middle East. The Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood said, just in 2010, long after the 70s in which they supposedly condemned violence, he said, resistance is the solution against Zio-American arrogance and tyranny. The resistance can come from fighting and understanding. This is from Mohammed Beatty, the head of the Brotherhood in Egypt. This is 2010, basically reiterating the declaration of war that Osama bin Laden said in the 90s. There is no coincidence that there's a revolving door between leaders of al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. I think, as has been said before, we begin pegging off various groups as terrorist groups from Syria to Libya to Yemen to Kuwait and on, and then ultimately that will begin to cut the funneling of money, funneling of ideas into other Muslim Brotherhood groups in the West. So my final recommendations, Chairman, is to, one, designate the MB a foreign terrorist organization beginning in Egypt and then on a country-country basis in Libya, Syria, Kuwait, Jordan, and Yemen. Call out American Muslim leaders to take a position on the Muslim Brotherhood and its overarching theopolitical ideology. I ask my fellow Muslims, will they be on the side of freedom, liberty, and modernity, or will they be on the side of tyranny of the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey's AKP, the Iranian Khomeinis, or Pakistan's Jamaat Islamiyya? Develop foreign policy mechanisms to disincentivize Qatari and Turkish government facilitation of the Brotherhood, and ultimately think about suspending Turkey from NATO. Use the MB designation as a template to transition immediately from the currently useless ideological center of CVE, countering violent extremism, to the more practical one of countering Islamism. And please stop engaging Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups in government, media, and NGOs, and recognize their Islamist terror sympathies. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Benjamin, you're up for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss this important subject. The title of this hearing, The Muslim Brotherhood's Global Threat, invites comment on two questions. The first is whether there is a singular entity entitled the Muslim Brotherhood. The second is whether that entity or some group of Muslim Brotherhood branches or affiliates represent a genuine global threat. On the first question, the answer is straightforward. As scholars, intelligence analysts, and policymakers over many years have come to agree, there is today no singular monolithic Muslim Brotherhood. Decades after the genesis of the Egyptian Ikhwan, there is no central administration linking these many different groups, which are often said to have brotherhood links or of ideology or origins. In character and matters of doctrine, they vary greatly. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is an outlawed organization, many of whose members are incarcerated. In Jordan, the Brotherhood plays a legitimate political role in the form of the Islamic Front, which has played an important role in Jordan's parliament. The Kuwaiti Brotherhood's party is a legitimate member of that country's parliament. In Morocco, the Justice and Development Party has held the prime minister's position and is also said to be linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. Tunisia's Ennahda is frequently characterized as having ties to the Brotherhood, though the party has probably confounded the expectation of Brotherhood members elsewhere by saying that it is separating politics from religion. It's notable that just a week ago, an Ennahda member, a woman, was elected mayor of Tunis, and that she does not wear a veil. Again, no serious researcher has demonstrated durable links between these groups that could be described as ones of command and control. Does the Muslim Brotherhood constitute a global threat? Here, too, I would answer that it does not. Most of the groups that are said to be Brotherhood affiliates or franchises support the democratic process and have abjured violence, if they ever embraced it. The Egyptian Brotherhood forswore violence in the 1970s. There's no compelling evidence that it has reversed course. It is noteworthy that two Egyptian Brotherhood splinter groups, Liwa al-Thawra and Hassam, were designated earlier this year under Executive Order 13224 as terrorist organizations, and both do indeed have a record of violence. It is, however, fallacious to suggest that this is a sign of the Brotherhood's return to violence. These groups appear to have split off because their members wanted to commit violence while the Brotherhood as a whole did not. I want to be clear, I have no sympathy for the Muslim Brotherhood. The Egyptian group, for example, often delivers hate-filled anti-American and anti-Western pronouncements that are truly repellent. But if there is a threat emanating from the various organizations that can be grouped as part of the Brotherhood family, it is that repression against them may cause them to decide that violence is their only option. Anyone looking for the place where the next great jihadist wave will break would have to consider Egypt a strong possibility. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood has hundreds of thousands of members, and despite the poor governance of Mohamed Morsi, millions of sympathizers. The widespread use of extrajudicial killing, indiscriminate incarceration, and torture has created a situation in which moderate Islamists, people who want their society to be more Islamic but do not support violence, have no good options. They may come to see themselves as cornered and having no alternative but to take up arms. And it is important to remember that jihadism emerged in Egypt, and specifically from the notorious Torah prison, amid the persecutions of the Nasser period. It will be a tragedy and indeed a strategic blunder if that lesson has been forgotten. A few other quick observations. First, the Trump administration evaluated the Brotherhood immediately after coming into office and determined that there was no legal basis to designate the group. Although there has been much speculative writing in the press about the orientation of the Brotherhood, the State Department's decision not to designate is telling. Department decisions are not based on open-source information of uncertain quality. Instead, designation decisions are based on all-source information, including classified intelligence. The fact that such a review took place and that the wishes of senior policymakers to designate the group were well known tells a clear story. No basis was found for designating at the time. I am unaware of any indication that there is more of a basis now. I am also unaware that this issue is being reviewed again within the government. A final point, policymakers and legislators, like physicians, must keep in mind the injunction to do no harm. A hardline approach to the Muslim Brotherhood groups and their members could do significant harm. The United States may be enjoying improved relations with some Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, countries, it should be noted, whose opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood is at least in part rooted in their opposition to democracy. But its reputation globally among Muslims, that is the United States' reputation, is at a low point due to President Trump's travel ban, his talk about a national registry of Muslims, and other negative comments about Muslims. The U.S. faces a real and continuing threat from jihadist terrorist violence. Unwise actions to target the Muslim Brotherhood groups will only deepen the animus against America, and we should not do anything that helps our enemies attract more recruits. That, too, would be a blunder. It would also be a blunder to further alienate already discomfited members of the domestic American Muslim community. The last thing the U.S. needs to do is to encourage radicalization at home. I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank the gentleman. The chair notes the presence of the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, a member of the full committee. We thank you for your interest in this topic, and without objection, I'd like to welcome Mr. Grothman to participate fully in today's hearing, and without objection, it's so ordered. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Jasser, the argument I think somewhat sketched out by Ambassador Benjamin is that if you take a strong stand against the Brotherhood like you articulated, that you're alienating so-called moderate Islamists, and that ends up leading to more terrorism. So how do you respond to that?
Well, again, I'd use the Cold War analogy, where we were worried when we took on the militant Soviets that we would alienate the moderate non-Soviet communists. The Muslim community, it is beyond bigoted to say that the Muslim community is represented only by our establishment Islamists who dominate oppressively our community. So what better way than the country founded on defeating theocracy, the United States, to take a position against the militant arm of the theocratic branches of the Islamic faith? And I think that it would send a message around the world that we recognize that the Brotherhood is a militant organization, and we that way build a platform for what I believe is a majority of the non-Islamist voices. There were 10 million people that went to the streets in Egypt to protest in Revolution 2.0 against the Brotherhood. 90% of those folks were Muslims. And yet it seems that from the arguments of the ambassador and others, that the only people we care about are the wings of this oppressive party that are nonviolent and somehow want to use democracy as a tool to get the power and then oppress the rest of the folks. If you look, I was on the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, met with the Brotherhood in 2013 in Cairo, and I can tell you that in speaking to them, they have no interest in changing their mission, what they are, what their goal is. They see the world through the lens of theocracy, not through egalitarian rights. To say you can moderate the Brotherhood is like saying you can moderate the Communist Party into capitalists. It's impossible.
And so, I mean, just to sketch out the ideology, I mean, what does that mean for Christians and Jews or other religions?
Well, there's barely any, if any, Jews left in Egypt because of the Islamists and what they've done in that country, and also dictatorship. The Islamists, when they get into power, are not only anti-Semitic. Listen to their imams and clerics and what they preach out of Al Jazeera, from Qaradawi on down. Minorities, women's rights. The ambassador may have cited that they had one not hijabbed woman, but the bottom line, that's window dressing for a central authority that is misogynistic and interprets the Quran and other Sharia interpretations that say that women get a quarter of the vote, a half a vote of a man, a quarter of the inheritance, et cetera. So they, as you saw in the way they put forth the Constitution in Egypt, have no interest in a egalitarian, liberal, secular constitution. Their interest is the Islamic State and giving people rights not under God, but under Islam and their interpretation of Islam, where minorities, Coptic Christians, apostates, they call moderate Muslims who are anti-Islamist apostates. They put people in jail, as Morsi did hundreds and thousands, for criticizing him as criticizing Islam. That's theocracy.
Now, this notion of a moderate Islamist, I mean, Islamism is inherently like not moderate, because I mean, if you want Islamism to be the governing faith, that's a totalitarian, not democratic. And so to say that that's moderate, I mean, maybe it means you're not launching terrorist attacks, but you still want an end that is very illiberal, I think. I want to, the chart you put up, and I want to see if you had it. You had the Islamist wing, then you had the Brotherhood, and then kind of the terrorism growing out of that. And people say, well, the Brotherhood, they're not necessarily directing every terrorist attack, and I think that's true. But is it safe to say that the Brotherhood's ideology has served as kind of the intellectual foundation that has sprung a lot of the terrorist groups that we've seen, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to everything in between?
Absolutely. I'm a doctor. In the daytime, I treat patients in disease. We don't treat symptoms. One of the primary global cancer cells for the development of Al-Qaeda, Islamic Jihad, all of these offshoots, the primary source of training ground is the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of them train to be part of the secret committee to ultimately be violent, and some of them come to the West to make sure our policy remains defensive and not offensive. So ultimately, the goals of their ideology is to create Islamic states and a caliphate, and that has never changed.
Mr. DeSantis.
Dr. Fratkin, in terms Sisi gave a speech, probably a couple years ago now, where he challenged a lot of the Islamist clerics and said, look, we cannot, and he's a devout Muslim, but he was making the point that you can't have a faith that is at war with everybody who disagrees. That's billions of people. And I think he has made the decision that you really have to marginalize the Brotherhood. What do you think? Is Dr. Jasser right, or is a more targeted approach as enunciated by Dr. Shanzer? What are your views? How would you comment on those?
Thank you very much for the question. It's an excellent one. I'm not myself clear yet about just how one goes about tackling the Brotherhood in terms of the designation of it as a terrorist group. What I am clear about is that it does, it creates the conditions for terrorist groups in the way in which that Dr. Jasser said, in the sense that it is the original version of the ideology which underlies the undertaking. Another thing I think should be observed is this. We have tried to engage with the Brotherhood. And let's put it this way: Egypt has been has been an experiment in several ways. First, we had an experiment of how the Brotherhood would behave in power, and it had been proposed before that when they come to power, they would be, through the exercise of power, they would learn to be moderate. That we saw was false, and there are reasons why it was false, because when they saw the opportunity to exercise total power, they were keen to. We also had an experiment of trying to understand them as a vehicle for moderate politics, of engaging with them on that, in that direction. That experiment began, well, it began actually in the Bush administration in a variety of ways. But its most visible expression was President Obama's speech in Cairo, which, among other things, went out of its way to welcome the Brotherhood. They were welcomed to the speech itself, somewhat against the wishes of Mubarak.
My time's up, so you all have a chance to enunciate, but I want to give Mr. Lynch, get him in here, and so I'll recognize Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask unanimous consent. I have a letter here, a statement by Ryan Crocker, an eminent diplomat in the service of our country, and I'd ask that it be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. I do want to make a distinction here about what the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. So there are a lot of conservative, we would even say repressive regimes around the country, around the world. There are many, militant or extremist groups around, but the terrorist designation is targeted toward activity, conduct, war on the civilian population. And so that's a different terminology and a different meaning than simply targeting regimes or organizations because they are conservative in their ideology. So it's an important distinction to make. The other challenge we have here, and I've heard it from each of you, is our ability to target specific organizations for that unacceptable behavior, that waging of war on the civilian population and terrorist activity. So, Mr. Fradkin, you've said as much. Dr. Scanzer, you were saying in your testimony, which was very helpful, I think, and thoughtful, that rather than do this blanket label of terrorism on the whole Muslim Brotherhood, then go after the individual groups that are actually undertaking this unacceptable activity. And I completely agree. Dr. Jasser, you as well. Country by country, let's target these people and call them out and isolate them in a way that doesn't make them stronger, but isolates them and weakens them. And Ambassador Benjamin, I know you didn't speak directly to this issue, but in the past, our success in isolating some of these groups has been our ability to differentiate the bad actors from the surrounding population and severing their local support. That seems to be what's happening in many cases in the Middle East, where the younger population, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the younger population is rejecting some of the more extreme edicts of the Muslim Brotherhood. Is that something, is that an approach that you think would be successful given your experience on the ground as an ambassador?
Mr. Lynch, the United States has had great success in isolating terrorist groups and cutting off their well springs of support, if you will, and diminishing their appeal to the broader population. The United States has a much more mixed record when it comes to intervening in the politics of other countries and telling foreign populations who we approve of and who we don't. We and our ambassadors, our envoys, should by all means speak out against hatred, speak out against anything that promotes division and promotes antipathy towards the West. But our ability to take on the Muslim Brotherhood in the various countries when it is not a group engaged in terrorist activities is going to be challenging, if anything, given the fact that most of these countries, the Muslim Brotherhood now has a political party. It's in the parliament, requires, I think, that we engage with them more and suggest that the benefits of moderation are available to all of those who pursue truly democratic policies and the pluralistic vision that the United States has stood for.
Thank you. I do want to take a minute here to read. I thought the statement by Ryan Crocker was instructive and important. He says here, and obviously Ryan Crocker served in Beirut during the bombings of the Marine barracks there, served for many years in Iraq. I've had many dealings with him. I think I've got over 20 trips to Iraq while he was our ambassador there. But he writes that after 38 years of his service as a Foreign Service officer, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a monolithic organization. He adds that it's not an organization at all in the conventional sense of the term. It has no international headquarters, nor an identifiable global leadership. Individual country franchises vary dramatically in their ideology and politics, and especially in their attitudes towards political violence. At one extreme, he acknowledges, would be the Syrian Muslim Brothers, who carried out a number of lethal bombings throughout the country in the 1970s. At the other would be the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, Jordan, North Africa. In Iraq, post-2003, the only organized Sunni political party was the Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated Islamic Party in Iraq. And during his time in Iraq, 2007 to 2009, he worked closely with the Islamic Party and its leader, Iraqi Vice President Tariq al-Hashmi. So I think what he's pointing to is the wisdom of discerning which of these affiliates and groups is engaging in terrorism and which are engaging in political activity. The distinction I made before about whether someone is labeled a radical or an extremist and one who is labeled as a terrorist. And so I hope we are precise in our language here and precise in our goal. The other challenge with terrorism is their ability to adapt. And I think that just putting out a blanket designation on the Muslim Brotherhood, they will sidestep that in a heartbeat. And those organizations will reconfigure and reassemble in a way that will do nothing to reduce their lethality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Dr. Yasser, good seeing you again. This conversation is headed just in the right direction here. So one of the biggest problems in making policy decisions with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood is the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood frequently creates front groups that, while ostensibly are separate, but in reality have close ties with the mothership in Egypt. This can include respectable institutions such as civil rights organizations, community groups, and charities. A recent report by the Middle East Forum concerning Islamic Relief, an international aid charity, documented extensive ties between Islamic Relief and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. One of the numerous examples given was the fact that Hassam el-Haddad, a co-founder of Islamic Relief Worldwide, became a foreign policy advisor to Mohamed Morsi, and according to Egyptian prosecutors, used Islamic relief monies to fund Muslim Brotherhood terrorism in Egypt. Question: does this tendency of the Muslim Brotherhood to form ostensibly separate spin-off groups under more respectable sources concern you? And secondly, what should our policy towards those organizations be?
Thank you, Congressman Gosar, and it's good to be here. Thank you. I think I can't tell you enough how important this issue is. And while I believe that the first thing I'd respond is tell you that the best way to marginalize groups that are front groups in the West, or I call them Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups, because they don't go by the name Muslim Brotherhood. In the United States, we've not had religious parties, so they've not operated openly. In London, they operate openly. The Muslim Brotherhood has a office. Ikhwan website is operated out of London. But if you want to decrease their influence, the to and fro passage of money, Islamic Relief, for example, is a great example. They have donated to Islamic Relief Worldwide. The Middle East Forum has an excellent report that was put out a week or two ago that looks at all of the revolving doors between radical Islamist terror groups around the world and Islamic Relief. I mean, Bangladesh, a Muslim country, does not allow Islamic Relief to do humanitarian work with Rohingya refugees because they're worried about radicalization. So the problem with front groups in the West, I think, will be diminished, not by designating groups that operate in the West here under other names. I think it's too hard to do that. But once you designate the mothership in Egypt, the Brotherhood, a terrorist organization, you designate the Yemeni, the Kuwaiti Brotherhood as terror organizations, it is going to be much more radioactive. Their platform of dominating our community, and this is why if you look at the Muslim Student Association, I'd ask you all to look at the explanatory memorandum. The FBI put it into the documentation of the Holy Land Foundation trial that laid out the network of Muslim Brotherhood organizations and what their plan is in the West. That stood the test of time in the court system and has not been refuted effectively because it is the truth that that was their operation. So they are a threat. I think they oppress our own community here through their money, through their work with Qatar and other Turkey. I mean, in Turkey just 2 weeks ago, an organization called USCMO, the U.S. Consortium of Muslim Organizations, which is basically the Muslim Brotherhood leadership in America, went to congratulate Erdogan on his win in Turkey, supposedly as a democratic win. Forget the fact that he imprisons journalists, tortures professors. All these things didn't matter to them because he's one of the brothers. So if I'm going to have a voice, and our Muslim reform movement is going to have a voice in the United States, the best way to weaken our main antagonists, which are the Islamists, is to begin to diagnose their foreign terror organizations that they sympathize with as terrorist organizations, the Brotherhood.
So my next question, you should be right on line. In the case of the Islamic Relief USA, a chapter of the Islamic Relief International that pays 20% of its income to Islamic Relief International, it has received at least $700,000 in federal funds, and when accounting for various umbrella groups, possibly much more. Should U.S. tax dollars be barred from going to such organizations?
I believe once you designate the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and many of the offshoots I talked about, named Muslim Brotherhood as terrorist organizations, then you can do the same thing to Islamic Relief that you did to the Holy Land Foundation because Hamas is a terrorist organization. But because they're funneling money through third parties that are not designated as terrorist organizations, they get away with it. So the short answer to your question is yes, we should stop giving them money, but you can't do that until you designate the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Comer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions will be asked to the first three gentlemen on the panel. Ambassador Benjamin testified that most Muslim Brotherhood affiliates support democracy and renounce violence. Is that true? Doctor? Yes.
No, I don't think so. What has been true is the issue of violence, as far as the Brotherhood is concerned, going back to the beginning, was a tactical question. Was it useful at any particular stage to use violence to advance their goals. And about Al-Qaeda has no doubt that violence is good, but the Brotherhood sees it otherwise. But as such, there is no repudiation of violence, and that's just, there's no such statement in the historical record.
The Egyptian Brotherhood has formally abjured violence in the 1990s.
No, you said in your testimony they abjured it in the 60s and 70s when they did, it says that, what was passed to us, and in the 60s and 70s they were in prison, so they had no option to exercise violence. I'm not saying that they're for it, in a big way, but it's just not true that and this is the flip side of the assertion. The flip side of the assertion is that they are interested in entry into a normal, moderate politics, and that also is not true. And in the case of the Egyptians, they thought they took what they could get under Mubarak, under Sadat, and then when they thought they had bigger opportunities, they went in a different direction. I want to, if I may, this links up to the question that, or an observation that Congressman Lynch made earlier, that the question before us has always to do with action, terrorist action, and violence. And it's important to focus on that, because that's the way in which we conceive of the threat and also the way in which our laws are written. And that's terribly important, but to some degree, and I agree with you, Congressman Lynch, that's the way in which we first have to approach the issue. The problem is, it does skew the discussion, insofar as it suggests that those who are not immediately active in violence, or even if they've eschewed violence, as Ambassador Benjamin asserts, are parties to be worked with, the parties that are useful for interaction. And we have had, this is a continuous tendency. Once you sort of make the distinction between the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, you say, okay, these are the guys we can work with. And it was worthwhile having the experiment, perhaps, but we've had such experiments, and they haven't worked.
Thank you.
Yeah, Congressman Comer, thank you for the question. Look, what I would say is that in each of the cases that we look at around the Middle East, these groups have been shaped by their environment. So if they operate under a repressive regime, they are often left with no recourse but to recognize the regime and to renounce violence. They are more than willing to engage in the democratic process, but there's really nothing in their creed, right, which is ultimately the dogma that they all adhere to at their core, that suggests that they have given up violence as an approach, or that they've embraced democracy. So I think we just need to remember that they have been forced into making a lot of these decisions over time. Whether they are organically going to remain there, I think, is another question entirely.
And if I could add, I think to take what one or two Muslim leaders that happened to be sitting with Americans at the time and telling ambassadors what they think they want to hear is one thing, versus what they're actually telling their own people. And when the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood in 2010, decades after the so-called change of approach towards violence, tells his leaders that he is telling them that the best goal is to attain death and sacrifice through a jihadi generation against the U.S. and against the Ziono-American conspiracy, that is a jihadi call to arms. And that was in 2010, at the same time of with Al-Qaeda and other groups, so it sounded very similar. And I think, basically, we're hearing from some leaders that we should just continue a whack-a-mole approach to the Muslim Brotherhood program, rather than actually treating the primary central organization as being a terrorist organization based on its ideology. And by the way, if the anti-violence approach to them is true, we would be able to find rifes of theological disagreements with the Brotherhood's approach. Their logo would have changed. All these things would have changed. None of that has happened. They're just telling a few ambassadors when they meet with them what they want to hear, so that we don't interfere in their business in taking over various countries.
If I may, sir, my points are largely being distorted here. First of all, there's no legal basis whatsoever for designating the Brotherhood on the basis of ideology. Terrorist designations are done on the basis of violent act. Right. That's it. So for Dr. Jasser to talk about designating the Muslim Brotherhood is absurd.
Well, what % of them should be violent suicide and answers? 10, 20, 80%? What percent?
You have to identify individuals and you have to find groups that are carrying out these acts. And that's how the law works, and that's how the State Department works, and that's how we have worked throughout. And if we get into the business of deciding that a group should be designated because we don't like its ideology, first of all, we're contravening our own values in terms of freedom of speech and of discourse, and we're undermining our own interests. The United States government has espoused the belief for many, many decades that anyone who participates in the democratic process honestly and so far as we can tell, and this is based on both intelligence and on the basis of their statements, that we ought to talk to them. That is what engaging with them means. It doesn't mean that we're giving them money. It doesn't mean that we're giving them any benefits. We are talking to them. That is it. And socialization through those processes typically, but not always, has positive effects. And we might have actually had a worse experience with Mr. Morsi if we had not known the Muslim Brotherhood at all before. And we might have had a better experience had we had a more robust dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood before. And it's important to note that the reason that we did not have a more robust dialogue was because autocratic leaders prohibited us from doing so in their country. And the cycle of repression and rebellion will go on as long as we are always beholden to those autocrats.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sorry I had to be over on the floor, so I didn't get to hear your testimony. And I really know very little about this particular issue, and I read that the Muslim Brotherhood has affiliates in 70 countries. How many members are there? How many people are there in the Muslim Brotherhood altogether? Does anybody know? Yes,
Millions.
Ambassador?
We don't know. No one has a global figure, but it's in the millions.
Well, they won an election in Egypt, so they did that by having initially 20 to 30% of the vote, and then they won a runoff against the former intelligence operation for Mubarak. So, in various countries, they can swing 20, 30% of the active Islamists, which are 30% about of the population. So politically, they're a large group.
Well, I understand that at least the first three witnesses here think we should designate the, is that not correct? Not correct. Okay. So of the people who are in the Muslim Brotherhood, how many what percentage do you think are violent or advocate violent activities? Anybody have an opinion about that?
Congressman Duncan, in my testimony, I did note that there are a number of organizations that have already been designated, Hasm Liwa Thawra, Hamas. I suggested two others, one in Libya, another one in Yemen, where I think we would probably see evidence that would meet the criteria, which is a fairly simple criteria when you look at the Treasury designation process in particular. State Department's a little bit more fuzzy. And then I think, from there, we need to think about targeting violent individuals within the factions that are officially nonviolent or are taking part in the process, because we know that there are more hardline members within each of these factions, those that support violence, those that don't. So this needs to be a targeted process across the board according to our criteria of designation.
And
okay, but do we have an opinion as to, is it a very small number or percentage of the people who are in the Muslim Brotherhood that would be considered violent or prone to violence?
Very small.
Very small.
Congressman Duncan.
Very small. Certainly those who have actually been involved in violent activities, it would be significantly less than 1%. Those who have joined splinter groups, that's another matter, but those splinter groups tend to be small. You know, one of the things that is somewhat problematic about this panel is that, you know, the vast scholarly literature on the Muslim Brotherhood emphasizes that the overwhelming amount of energy in the last 2 decades has gone into the creation of political parties, which are, by definition, opposed to carrying out violence, okay? It is true that the Muslim Brotherhood historically has been a group from which splinters or sparks have been thrown off, and those people have become more violent. Al-Qaeda, the original al-Jihad group, those people were originally influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood and then became more radical. But the Brotherhood itself, as far as we know, and certainly this was the state of the intelligence when I left the government, there are no major entities of the Muslim Brotherhood, setting aside Hamas, which is a special case and may not even be considered by some people to be Brotherhood, that are committed to violence.
Congressman Duncan, this very...
Let me just say this. You know, I've been here a long time. This is my 30th year. I was here for the first Gulf War, which I voted for, because I heard all of our top leaders say that Saddam Hussein was the greatest threat since Hitler, and they talked about his elite troops. And then I saw those same elite troops surrendering to CNN camera crews and empty tanks. And so I became kind of skeptical about some of these things. And so when the second Gulf War rolled around, I ended up voting against it because I thought too many of our leaders were too eager to go to war to prove they were new Winston Churchills or prove that they were great leaders. And so I've felt for a long time that it's been a very sad thing that we've sent so many young Americans to fight what I thought were very unnecessary wars. And I also noticed that many of the people or groups that were talking about how great these threats were people or groups that were going to get money, that were, and that these threats seem to be more about money and power than they were about any great threats. But I see, Dr. Shanger, you wanted to respond to the ambassador, so go ahead and respond.
Yeah, look, what I would say is that I don't know where that number comes from, that it's 1% or 5% or 10%. It's not like, you know, we're looking at poll numbers coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood where people are calling their homes and saying how many of you are radical, and they're openly admitting to it, right? I mean, we don't know exactly what the numbers look like within
I said those were the numbers of people involved in violence.
What we can say, though, is that when we look at radicalization, we have to look at those that go to the battlefronts. That's number one. And we do see a good number of people who were former brothers that have gone on to join groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. But also, when you look at the criteria, the Treasury criteria, I'm a former Treasury terror finance analyst. We look at basically 4 criteria. One is, are organizations owned or controlled by a terrorist organization? Are the individuals members? That's number one. That's obvious. Number 2 is financial support. That is the same in the view of law. As engaging in violence itself. Another is technical support, and then another one is material support. These are the criteria that we need to look at when we assess Brotherhood groups and individuals. And I think we'll find that it's not 1%, but it's also not 50%. There's some fuzzy math in there. I don't know how we'll ever get to it, but there is a problem within the Brotherhood. We know that for a fact.
And if I could add just one thing, Congressman. Sure. These mental gymnastics and confusions that you're having is exactly what the Brotherhood wants to happen by dividing themselves into secret committees that push forth violent arms and other committees that use political processes to come to power. They use liberation theology to basically advance no different than a Nazi party would or other fascist arm would, and they use militant arms and then claim denial when they are pushed by more moderate democracies like ourselves. So at the end of the day, that wing, if it truly has, they might eschew violence. But on the one hand, on the other hand, they have never condemned openly those arms of their organizations or ever taken ownership of having sprouted those ideas and legitimized those factions of terrorist organizations.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman, time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And listen, whether the number is 1%, 5%, or as you mentioned, up to 50%, the question is, and the issue is, we all know it doesn't take but a small number of radical terrorists to create an enormous problem around the world, wherever they may strike. So with that in mind, Mr. Jasser, let me begin with you. How important a role does violent jihad play in the Muslim Brotherhood ideology?
Well, I think it's central, and they might condemn certain tactics here or there, but at the end of the day, their motto has remained advocating for violent jihad. Their be prepared passage from the Quran is simply a battle that they use as their rallying cry. So at the end of the day, they are a jihadist organization that believes in the technique of violence as one of the avenues to be used.
Okay, so let's look at an example of that. How did the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood treat religious minorities, say Coptic Christians?
I was there in 2013, and they committed, and their leaders and imams called for acts of violence upon Christian communities, upon the Coptic community. And while there may have been some debate here or there was impunity given to various Islamist leaders that called for those acts of violence. And especially after they lost power in 2013, it became no holds bar, and it's been that way since.
All right, so let's bring it closer to home. What kinds of activities does the Muslim Brotherhood engage in here in the United States? Do we know what's happening here? What kind of plans, or what can you tell me with that?
Look, I have to say I'm not an expert on the Muslim Brotherhood here in the United States. I've been more focused on the splinter groups and affiliate groups abroad. But what we can say is certain groups have been involved in terror finance cases. We have seen examples of this. The Holy Land Foundation, for example, is sort of a famous one. That was an organization that was providing $12 million to Hamas over the course of about a decade. And the Muslim Brotherhood group CARE was an unindicted co-conspirator in that case. It had an unspecified role in that case. So we've seen examples of this in recent history. But again, I think the important thing to note here is that we need to see a certain criteria in order to designate them. In some cases, we just might see examples of troubling behavior. And this is where I think we need to, with all respect to all of my panelists, we need to be looking simply at the criteria, not how troubled we are about a certain ideology. We need to be there is a criteria in the U.S. government for designation. We go after those groups in the U.S. that are in violation of our law, and we continue to watch those that may be exhibiting some troubling behavior.
Okay, thank you. But by your own admission, you're not an expert of this in the United States. So Dr. Jasser, let me go back to you. What other radical Islamic movements outside of the Muslim Brotherhood should we be concerned about here in the United States?
Well, it's interesting, actually. If you look, for example, at the Khomeinis, Hezbollah was designated a terror organization. We had sanctions against Iran for decades. That's one of the reasons there haven't been as many acts of Shia-inspired radical. It's not because the Hezbollah or the Khomeinis in Iran love America. They chant death to America all the time. But the sanctions and the inability to fund and build mosques like the AKP now is building in Maryland and elsewhere, like the funneling of money from Saudi Arabia. I mean, up until just a few months ago, Saudi Arabia was actually intimately involved in the spread of the Brotherhood into Europe and in the West. So if you look at our own national security incidents, San Bernardino, Boston bombing, Awlaki. Awlaki came through the Muslim Student Association, which was part of the motherships of the Muslim Brotherhood history, progeny here in the United States, that then evolved. Now, Awlaki then left the Brotherhood ideology to become a Salafi jihadist and join al-Qaeda and go to Yemen, but that revolving door of ideology, if you look at the radicalization of a lot of Islamists in the United States that go from the belt, the conveyor belt of nonviolent sort of political, anti-American, anti-Semitic political Islam that go towards radicalization, it often starts with Brotherhood legacy groups in America. And I'll tell you, as a Syrian American, the Syrian American Council is one of the central parts of that. Its own leadership has said its affiliation with the Brotherhood in Syria is one of the reasons the United States ended up funding a lot of radical Islamist groups, including Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and other radical groups in Syria, because of Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers in the United States that told them, oh, they're okay. And you can find this by doing research, by looking at their Facebook, social media posts that sympathize with those groups in Syria.
Thank you. Could you provide this committee with a list of all those?
Absolutely. It's in my written testimony that was submitted, sir.
Okay. All of them?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, Mr. Rice, I believe just to expand on Dr. Chanzer's testimony, there hasn't been a prosecution in the United States of a Hamas affiliate since the Holy Land Foundation. Is that correct, Jonathan?
No, I don't believe there has been.
And that was in the late 90s?
That was early 2000s.
Okay. Early 2000s. My point being simply that the Department of Justice and the Treasury Department are watching potential terrorist activity, and the FBI, of course, very, very vigorously. And I think that the paucity of prosecutions tells a very important story about the lack of activity going on in the United States at this time.
I'd like to respond to that for just a moment, because I don't think that that actually captures the full picture. There has not been a designation of a U.S. charity here in the United States since 2009. Okay? What it means is that we have a problem with the system, that we're not looking at charities, we're not looking at the nonprofits that could be in violation of our laws. I actually believe that during the Obama administration, not to make this political, but during those years, the fact that we did not have a designation to me is very troubling, because I don't believe that there was no terror finance activity coming out of the U.S. So that does not exonerate the Muslim Brotherhood. To me, it seems as if the system was not working for the last decade, and I'm hoping that we get to see a reinvigoration of that system now.
Thank you for that answer, and I agree.
Gentleman's time's
I yield back.
expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Ambassador Benjamin, I'll start with you. You're affiliated with the Brookings Institution, is that correct?
I'm a non-resident senior fellow there.
Okay. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the inner workings of the Brookings Institution, but are you aware they've taken almost $15 million from the Qatari government?
I am aware that Brookings has a center in Doha, and that it has, like many other institutions in the United States, accepted funds from foreign governments, including Qatar.
Okay. Do you know why Qatar would be funding the Brookings Institution, or why they would find it of interest to give them $15 million?
So I don't want to speak for the institution. I know that because I have participated in it, that Brookings hosts or co-hosts a annual Islamic World Forum, which is held, I think, half the time in the United States, half the time in Qatar, and brings distinguished speakers from all over the world to talk about issues of common interest. And as I said before, Brookings has a center in Doha where it carries on scholarly activities much like those that it carries on here.
Okay, a fellow at the Doha Center, and this is what I'm trying to come around, someone named Salim Ali, was quoted as saying in the New York Times, if you can believe the New York Times, there was a no-go zone when it came to criticizing the Qatari government, and the members of Congress using Brookings reports on Qatar should be aware they're not getting the full story. Do you feel that by accepting $15 million, it colors at all the view of the Brookings Institution when it comes to talking about Qatar and therefore the Muslim Brotherhood?
I worked at Brookings before going into the Obama administration. I was the director for the Center on the U.S. and Europe. We accepted grants from the European Union, among others, and I have the highest regard for my fellow scholars at Brookings and believe strongly that their views are not influenced by the sources of their funding, in much the same way that their sources, that their views are not influenced by the corporate funding, which is another frequent source of funding at Brookings and throughout the think tank world, or from foundations, whose leadership may have particular views, but those views are not imposed upon the scholars. And the think tanks generally in Washington work very hard to avoid having the views of their donors appear in their reports.
They just hit 15. I don't know how big Brookings is. $15 million just hits me as a kind of a large sum of money, and I just wondered, can you speculate on what motive the Qatar government, which is sponsoring Muslim Brotherhood as well, what motivation they would have in giving such a large contribution to Brookings?
In my dealings with the Qataris, which have been quite extensive, I know that they are interested in building dialogue between the United States and their country and the Muslim world more broadly. And you know, we see this in many other contexts as well. You know, probably the biggest contributor to the think tank world is Norway, and I see no reason to impute any ill intentions to the Gutteries here, nor would I to the many think tanks that are receiving money from the UAE or from the Saudis, whose you know, opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood is very well known right now, even if in particularly the Saudi case, it's been anything but consistent.
Okay, I'll ask, say either one of the other of you. It's been implied by Mr. Benjamin that the Muslim Brotherhood is just kind of an umbrella name, and there's not a lot of coordination between Muslim Brotherhood in one country to another. I'd ask you to comment on that in general, whichever one of the three of you other three wants to comment.
I can say a little bit about that. I think that originally there was a good deal of coordination, and there's a desire for there to be such. Over time, it's been a mixed picture. For a very long time, the other Brotherhood chapters looked to the Egyptian chapter as the founding chapter. They still cooperate in the context of the 2011 Arab revolts. People went from Egypt to Tunisia to consult with their Brotherhood chapter. Actually, the Tunisians recommended that the Egyptian Brotherhood be a little bit more restrained. It was good advice, which they didn't take. And there is that kind of thing. Because of the situation that was referred to before by Jonathan Chanzer, it's harder for them to coordinate, but they will be looking to coordinate. And one of the issues is that one of the relevant considerations is where they will coordinate from. Qatar is one place because they do support the Brotherhood, and they provide in particular support for Al Jazeera, which is a platform for the most significant Brotherhood cleric, Qaradawi. But I think actually more important in the near future is going to be Turkey, because Turkey is a much bigger country. It's a more powerful country, and it has the wind in its sails now, or its president does. And I think it's pretty clear he's acting as if he is going to be the godfather to the Brotherhood. He's provided a safe haven for many of the Egyptians who had to flee Brotherhood and others. And what exactly he will do or what they will do under his auspices, I don't know. But because Turkey, of the character of Turkey and the fact that the government is so completely under the control of its president, there is much greater opportunity in the future for coordinating action, I would say.
Thank you. I believe my time is up.
Gentleman yields back. I want to again thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. And if there is no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.